On February 18th, 1997, about 25 years ago or so, three teenagers, ages 13, 16, and 17, went to a high school basketball game in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. Now, despite 17-year-olds seeming way too young to have a driver's license, I say that now as a 40-something-year-old person, this 17-year-old had possession of the keys to his father's brand new truck. And this truck would serve as the ride home for the 13 and the 16-year-old. But the car never made it home. This is the report of the car ride. Just seconds after pulling out of the high school parking lot, the teenager, the 17-year-old that was driving, grew impatient by the puttering of a compact vehicle in front of him, and so he tried to pass this sort of tinkering car on the left-hand side in a one-lane road. But the driver of the compact vehicle possessed really no inferior sense of pride and refused to let the annoyed teenager pass. And so immediately, for the next half mile or so, the immense truck and the small car in the right lane got into sort of an impromptu drag race, with the truck facing oncoming traffic and the small car in the right lane. Suddenly, the small car slowed down, evidently conceding defeat, and so the teenager, looking over his right shoulder and sensing overwhelming victory, decided to veer finally back into the right lane, unaware that he was approaching the light at a busy intersection. Braking would not help at this point as the truck piled into three other vehicles. Subsequent police reports indicated that the adolescent driver of the truck was traveling 87 miles an hour in a 45-mile-an-hour zone. The skid marks that were caused by the vehicle prior to impact measured 136 feet. All three teenagers, the 13-year-old, the 16-year-old, and the 17-year-old, survived. Everyone else in the car crash survived. Everyone stepped away from the incident without any serious injuries. Now today, these once tight-knit teenagers who are all around 40 and have gone their separate ways, they barely talk. But my guess would be that if you were to get the three of them together and ask them about their car accident, they would say that the best explanation for their survival in that nearly tragic night was divine intervention. Given the speed that these teenagers were traveling, given the force of their collision, it could be reasonably argued that none of those teenagers should be alive today. We thank God for preserving life. I thank God for preserving my life that night. I was the 16-year-old. My brother Emmanuel was the 13-year-old, and our friend T was the 17-year-old. The 17-year-old whose parents only lost the truck that night by the grace of God. Now, going through a near-death experience, we could say, helps you reflect on some things that you might already know, but it really helps you know things that you should already know. For example, our head knowledge becomes more of our reality when we pass through this types of situation. So through my experience, I really learned that life and death is in the hands of God. God has created all people in His image, and God has the right to determine when life comes into being and when life ends. I really learned that God preserves life to accomplish His purposes, whether people know exactly what those purposes are or not. God works by providentially guiding circumstances in a given situation, whether being directly invoked or maybe even noticed, right? For example, why did we put our seatbelts on that night? I remember vividly telling my brother to put his seatbelt on. If we were going just a little bit faster, or if we were in a smaller truck, or if the impact would have been in a different area of the cars that we hit, or even our car, right? God maneuvers circumstances and situations to carry out His purposes in ways that might be completely undetected by human beings. And it's sometimes only after a given situation that it becomes possible to look back and see God's sovereign hand guiding circumstances in a particular event. And only sometimes. There is no other biblical book in which these realities are more evident than in the book of Esther. Esther is filled with all types of engaging literary techniques like foreshadowing and gaps in the story and irony and maybe even some parody, and there are many lessons to be learned by the individual sections of the narrative. But by the end of the book, there's one reality that's really depicted and is extremely crucial in terms of salvation history: the salvation of the Jewish people group. Here's the irony. This is what is deliberately contrary to what we might expect here, okay? Here's the irony. The Old Testament covenant people are saved in the book of Esther without the covenant name of God, that is Yahweh, or some of your Bibles might say Jehovah, or the title God ever being mentioned. God's name or title, neither one of those things are mentioned in the book of Esther. So what we see is that in this book, in the book of Esther, we have Esther provides contemporary believers, I should say, the same framework, a framework by which we can see how God providentially works through people to carry out his purposes and his promises, we could say, without even being noticed. Now let's begin by reading Esther chapter 3, verses 1 to 7. We'll also skip and read verse 13, which is where the major conflict of the book begins. And then after reading this section, we'll actually jump back and we'll backtrack a little bit, provide a little bit of historical information before continuing through the narrative. Esther chapter 3, verse 1. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman. For the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" And when they spoke to him day after day, and he would not listen to them, they told Haman, in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand. For he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is, they cast lots before Haman day after day. And they cast it month after month till the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Then we read about how this wicked Haman's murderous plan went into effect in verse 13. If you skip down to verse 13. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with instructions to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. Now imagine a holiday in which children wear a costume, wander around the neighborhood in these festive outfits, and receive sweets from all over the place. Now, of course, you're thinking, Dr. Dom, it's not that hard. Haven't you ever heard of Halloween? Yeah, but imagine sort of a Halloween without the ghosts and the zombies and the gore. And imagine just the best parts of Halloween, the sweets and the costumes and the parties, with the biblical grounds to celebrate. Imagine that. This holiday actually exists. It's called Purim. Or at least that's how Purim is celebrated by the worldwide Jewish community on the 14th and 15th day of the Jewish month of Adar, depending upon where one lives. People dress up because Purim is a day of celebration. It's a day of celebration commemorated by the religious and the non-religious Jewish communities, though a little bit different. This is a day in which Jews celebrate the salvation of their people group as is recorded in the biblical book of Esther. In fact, one of the ways in which the salvation of the Jewish people is celebrated is by reading Megillat Esther, the scroll of Esther, in one sitting in its entirety. That's awesome. It's through the reading of this scroll that Jewish people are reminded of the salvation of their ancestors from the hands of their enemies, especially from the hand of wicked Haman. In fact, every time that Haman's name is mentioned in the public reading of Esther, those in attendance boo, literally, boo, kind of like Eagles fans, boo. And they shake these noisemakers. They're called rashan. They shake these noisemakers to demonstrate their displeasure with the name and the memory of Haman, as we see was to happen in Exodus 17:14 and Proverbs 10:17, that the name of the wicked is to be blotted out. And along with reading the entire book of Esther, Jewish people celebrate with all types of festivities. They eat these cookies called Oznei Haman, which means the ears of Haman. And they sing festive songs like the one that you're going to see now called Shoshanat Yaakov. Shoshanat Yaakov, Tzahala v'samecha, birotam yachad, techelet Mordechai. Can I join the worship team? Yes. All right. So the people of Israel, Shoshanat Yaakov is a poetic nickname for them. They rejoiced and became overjoyed when they saw Mordecai wearing royal blue. The next slide has the rest of the song. Their salvation was from eternity, and their hope is from generation to generation. Blessed be, or blessed is Mordecai the Jew. Blessed is Mordecai the Jew. Why would Jewish people sing such a song on Purim? Well, in order to understand the reason for this holiday Purim, or even the word Purim, as we read right now in Esther chapter 3, we have to know a little bit about the historical setting of the book of Esther. And the historical setting of the book of Esther goes all the way back to the late 6th century, so the 500s before Christ, okay? That's when many Jewish people from Jerusalem were taken into exile by the Babylonians in approximately 586 before Christ, so 586 years before Christ. And within about 70 years, the Babylonians were conquered by the Persians, which brings us to the time in which the book of Esther takes place, the Persian period. Now, if you go back to the beginning of the book of Esther, Esther chapter 1, verses 1 to 3, this section tells us a bit more about the setting of the book. We read in Esther chapter 1, verses 1 to 3. Now, in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia, over 127 provinces. In those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa the citadel, brief note, that's modern-day Iran, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors of provinces were before him. So here we observe that this king of Persia, during the time period of the Persian king, was Ahasuerus. You already know his name from chapter 3. And his kingdom spanned 127 provinces from the continent of Africa all the way through East Asia. All right? And in the 3rd year of his reign, he has a big feast. And we're told that all the kingdom's aristocrats and everybody's gathered together at Susa, the capital of the Persian Empire. And it's during this festival that, for reasons unstated in the text, remember I mentioned gapping. This information is not given to us. That's a theme throughout the book of Esther. For reasons unstated in the text, King Ahasuerus calls his wife, Queen Vashti, to appear before him in his royal crown. And Vashti, again, for unstated reasons, they're gapped in the text, we don't know, she refuses to come before the king. Okay, this enrages him. And so, based upon the counsel of his friends, the king divorces Vashti. Now, there's lots of irony in this book of Esther. Ironically, King Ahasuerus, this mighty King Ahasuerus, is depicted as a bit of a weak imbecile here at the very beginning of the book. And here's why. Not only in this scene, but in others to come. He reigns over all these kingdoms. 127 kingdoms from Africa to Asia, right? But he can't get his wife to come and see him. And so he divorces his wife at the counsel of his friends, but then he needs his friends to find him another wife because he misses his wife. He's depicted as not being the smartest of all biblical characters. And so, in an act that is really disconcerting at best, this should be disconcerting. The king's servants travel around the city of Susa and they gather the most attractive maidens. Why? So the king could just choose among the women which one he wants. And this is where Mordecai and Hadassah come onto the scene. So we know Hadassah as Esther, but her Hebrew language name was Hadassah. Mordecai probably was not his original name either. But in chapter 2, verse 7, we read the relationship between the two, and that he, Mordecai, was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her up as his own daughter. Then we read what happened to Esther as the king's servants rounded her up, as we continue to read in chapter 2. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, in custody of Hegai, Esther also was taken in the king's palace and put in custody of Hegai, who had charge of women. All right, now this is where things get interesting in the story, because when Esther is taken into the custody of the king, she is explicitly told, she's explicitly commanded by her cousin Mordecai not to reveal her identity as a Jew. Twice, chapter 2, verse 10, chapter 2, verse 20. We're not told why she's told not to reveal her identity, another gap in the story, but this point, combined with the fact that the king eventually falls in love with Esther and marries Esther not knowing her full identity as a Jewish person, foreshadows a problem that will arise when it's revealed that this not so smart king finds out that he's married a Jewish person. The potential for a major problem increases upon the events depicted in the passage that we read together today. Why? Because in Esther chapter 3, Haman the Agagite is now promoted to second in command in the king of Ahasuerus. And upon taking office, the king proclaims that everybody should bow down and pay homage to Haman. But for reasons, again, that are unexplained in the biblical text, another gap, Mordecai not only refuses to bow down, but he reveals that he's a Jewish person. I mean, talk about the unexpected. He does what he tells Esther not to do. Now, the narrator of the book of Esther kind of has us guessing a bit here for these gaps of information, right? But we get a clue here relating to this sort of imminent conflict. Like Mordecai's revelation as a Jewish person is mentioned together with his refusal to bow down. Now, those of us that are somewhat familiar with the Ten Commandments know that you only got to get past the first one to get to the second one, and the second one explicitly states, "You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in earth beneath, or that is in the water or under the water." And then check out the next phrase, "You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord, your God, am a jealous God." So maybe Mordecai admits he's a Jew and refuses to bow down to the Persian leader because he refused to treat him like God. But the narrator never tells us, and we continue to read, just waiting for this imminent conflict, and it comes almost immediately. Haman hates the fact that not everybody will bow down to him, and so he develops a personal, really illogical hatred for Mordecai, and here comes the irrational hatred for all of the people of Mordecai, and Mordecai actually implicates these people by admitting that he's a Jew. And so Haman casts lots, right? He casts lots. He casts Purim. That's how you would say lots here in Hebrew. Probably not a Hebrew word, but that's the word that we have here. And he does that in order to determine the dreadful day in which the Jews and all of the kingdom would be put to death. And so it's coldly determined that all of the Jews and all of the king of Ahasuerus would be put to death on the 13th day of the month of Adar, almost a year after the casting of the lots. And through all of this, God is not mentioned at all in the narrative. God's like apparently not present. God's name, God's personal name that he revealed to the people of Israel as his covenant people is not mentioned once. God's title's not mentioned at all. At a time when evidently the Jewish people needed him the most, he is nowhere to be found, apparently. Christians, the almost palpable absence of God that we sense in this text calls us to reflect the absence of God's presence that we might tangibly sense in our own lives. Christian, many times in our lives we have felt in need, maybe even right now, desperate need, physical need, spiritual need. We feel destitute at times. We even feel like we're experiencing maybe the physical, emotional, spiritual death, right? And God, we sense, is nowhere to be found. God's absent. He's not there. But here's a simple principle that we learn through the book of Esther. And though it's a principle that's repeatedly taught, it's very hard to apply. Sometimes when situations look dire, sometimes when we're going through difficult situations and God seems to be conspicuously absent, God's right there, working everything together for his glory. Sometimes when we have absolutely no assurance that God even cares about a given situation because there's simply no awareness of his presence, he is right there inextricably involved in the situation, just not revealing the details of his involvement. And here's the amazing thing that we have to be appreciative as readers of this narrative many years afterwards. God gives us, even as contemporary readers, insight into a past occasion in which he is inextricably involved in human affairs to carry out his purposes for the sake of the glory of his name and the growing of his kingdom through the book of Esther. It is this divine providence that we as the readers it's through this that we start to see that God, without being named or even officially credited with any of the actions, shapes circumstances in the lives of the characters so that he might accomplish his purposes. So as we read this narrative, we are privileged with the opportunity to reflect upon how God might be using specific circumstances right now in our lives in order to accomplish his purposes. Maybe we're just not noticing it. But let's look specifically at a few circumstances in our story that we could say were conspicuously guided by the divine hand, if we could say such a thing. All right? It just so happened that Esther, out of all the women in Susa that were gathered up, found favor in the eyes of the king. It just so happened that. It just so happened that this woman, who the king really, really liked, was a Jew. And it just so happened that this woman, who the king really, really liked, that was a Jew, had direct access to the king because of her position as queen. All right? We don't know how many women were taken into the courts of the king, but this specific one who was a Jew could approach the king in a privileged manner. And it just so happened that this specific one who could approach the king in this privileged manner was related to Mordecai, the guy that wouldn't bow down. And as we see, disobedient Mordecai, as at least to Haman, had access to the Persian throne through his orphan cousin who he had raised. Now, out of all of the women that the king could have married, all the women, right, that could have potentially had access to the throne, it turns out that the one that he married was a Jew herself. And not only was she a Jew, but she was closely related to the person who was not going to obey that very king's command to bow down to Haman. Now, all of this is key to tracking the story of Esther, because upon hearing the plans to slaughter the Jewish people, Mordecai dresses up in clothes representing mourning, and he goes to the entrance of the city gate, and he's permitted to have access to his very own cousin, Queen Esther, right? And he convinces his people in chapter 4, verses 13 and 14, to go and advocate for her people. Now, as you can see, this is a well-known verse, particularly the last line of 14. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this, Mordecai says to Esther. Esther, he says, don't forget that you're a Jew, right? You're going to feel the effects of Haman's wicked plot to kill us. But Esther, it just so happens that you have been placed in a position of power and influence for the sake of helping vulnerable people right now. Esther, in turn, reports to the king, reveals that she's a Jewish person, and Haman's wicked plot to kill the Jews would affect her. And as all of this was revealed, much to the surprise of Haman, obviously, he pleads for his life, but to no avail. He's eventually taken away and hung, or maybe impaled. The Hebrew's a little shaky here. We don't know exactly. He's put to death. But the redemption of the Jewish people is still not complete. According to the traditions of the Persians, remember in the Persian period now, another decree needed to be made in order to counteract the first. And so that's what we see happening in chapter 8, verse 11, where we read that the king allowed that the Jews who were in the city to gather and defend their lives. And by this counteracting decree that was made, the preservation of the Jewish people in the Persian Empire was accomplished on the very same day that Haman planned for their destruction. For the Jewish people, or for any people, but for the Jewish people in this historical context, this was cause for great celebration. And that's why the holiday Purim was instituted, as we read in Esther chapter 9, verse 27. The Jews firmly obligated themselves and their offspring and all who joined them that without fail they would keep these 2 days according to what was written at that time appointed every year. The day that Haman determined by casting lots, Purim, turned out to be a day of great salvation and celebration for the Jews. Well, great, wonderful. Let's go back to our question. Where was God in all of this? Where was God in all of this? God's not mentioned, no name, no title. Apparently God's not present. Salvation comes for the Jewish people, the covenant people, the people that had been identified with the people of Israel. Salvation comes for them, and God's not even mentioned to take credit for it. At a time when the Jewish people needed God the most, where is their, now, covenant God, the God that revealed his name to them? Where is he? Now, let's deal with this for a second. The reality of our story is the following here. Despite what some traditions might suggest, traditions influenced by Hollywood might suggest, concerning how honorable Esther and Mordecai were, here are just a couple of simple observations of the depictions of these characters that might help us understand why God may not have been mentioned in the book. There, first and foremost, seems to be no concern by either one of these main characters for Jewish law. The law that God gave to the people of Israel that was passed down to the Jewish people, right? For example, unlike Daniel, Esther doesn't seem to demonstrate any particular concern for dietary laws when she's taken into the court of a Gentile king. Daniel does. He's in the court of a Gentile king, lived even into the Persian period. Esther doesn't. At least it's not recorded. Esther conceals her Jewish identity. She lies by omission. At least that's what's depicted, right? When she's taken into the king's court, and she does this at the command of Mordecai, who basically is a father figure for her. It's like us telling our children not to reveal very specific information. Now, the implications of this, understand the implications of this are Esther having to violate the Torah, right? So, for example, she couldn't keep the purity laws, or it would have been revealed that she was a Jewish person. She couldn't keep the Sabbath, or it would have been revealed that she was a Jewish person. She couldn't keep the food laws, or it would have been revealed that she was a Jewish person. And she certainly couldn't keep all of these. And it's not until there's severe danger and perhaps even a threat, a bit of a threat, coming from her uncle that Esther reveals her true identity. Now, here's the thing that gets me. This is the major one that sort of like sticks out. Esther marries a Gentile king after spending one night with him. Now, intermarriage here, it's important to note that Jewish people were not explicitly forbidden from not marrying non-Jews. That is, intermarriage is never explicitly forbidden in the Bible, but we have no indication that this king has any intention on following the one true God of Israel. So we see intermarriage in the Bible, but the people of Israel were not permitted to do it with pagans. And this person is a pagan. So we take these observations into consideration, and it doesn't seem like Esther or Mordecai are particularly interested in following the law that God gave the people. It doesn't seem like Esther or Mordecai are especially interested in inviting him into the narrative, right? And this presents right here a perfect opportunity for the God of Israel to demonstrate to all people who would become familiar with this story that he's in control. God demonstrates his ability to control all circumstances and situations for his glory. To what end? Why did God save the people when, quite frankly, he was not invited into the story? God doesn't save people because they're extraordinary in and of themselves. God doesn't save people because they promise him that they will be good. God saves people because he's a magnificent God. God saves people because in this, he demonstrates extraordinary love for humankind despite all of us, by our nature, not inviting him into our story. And this is what we see in the first Purim festival. God saved the Jewish people from their enemies, not because they were extraordinary in and of themselves. God saved the Jewish people because he was and he is an extraordinary, faithful God who keeps his promises. Christians, this should drive us to praise. See, all the way back, if we go back to the beginning of this Bible, this compilation that we have, right, we see God promised Abraham that all the nations of the earth would be blessed through him. And this happened by God choosing Abraham's son, Isaac, and then Isaac's son, Jacob. Again, not because of what they did, read Romans chapter 9, but for the purposes of God. And as we continue to read through the Old Testament, we see Jacob was renamed Israel, and he had 12 sons. And out of these 12 sons, Judah was, which is where we actually get the word Jewish from, was chosen to bear the royal lineage. And King David, you ever hear that guy? He came from the people of Judah. And Jesus, the Messiah, the Savior of all humankind, was a descendant of King David, who was promised to come from the Jews, came from the Jews, came to the Jews, and through the Jews to all humanity. Through the Jews to people living in suburban Philadelphia. God was determined to carry out his promise of bringing blessing to all nations through the Jewish people by the person and the work of Jesus the Messiah, who was a Jew. One writer states it like this: Esther is part of a much larger story that runs all the way from Abraham to Christ and through him to the church. If Haman had succeeded, the Jewish people as a whole would have been destroyed. The story of God's saving work in and through Abraham's descendants would have come to an end. There would have been no fulfillment in Christ and therefore no gospel and no Christian church. And this is true, friends. Nothing less than that was at stake. Our God who keeps his word, our God is a God of integrity who keeps his word, and God's integrity is not contingent upon human beings. Our God does not and cannot let his word fail. Our God is willing to work providentially behind the scenes of humanity's vain activity and inattentiveness to his work in order to carry out that which he has promised. Now, the book of Esther is part of our own heritage as Christians, because this is not just part of our inheritance because it's a small book tucked away in the Old Testament in a section where books are difficult to find. That's not why. It's because it's another part of a greater story showing God's love for humanity by sending someone from the line of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, and David to save humankind from their problem of sin. The fact that God's not mentioned at all seems to point that it is almost as if this book was written for us to know that it's during those times of silence, times in which we do not overtly see God's hand at work, in times in which we may not ever feel God's presence around us. It's those times, maybe, when he's most active. And sometimes, God is simply active by way of preserving, by way of saving lives so that he might accomplish his purpose in and through us. I think about my story, and you, everybody has their story. I think about my car accident. If I were to have died, I would have died not really being serious about my relationship with Christ, which didn't happen until I was actually at Westchester. Thank you, Tom. I would have never gone to college. I'd never gone to grad school. All the things that Tom I would have never done any of that. I would have never had the opportunity to serve as a pastor. I would have never had the opportunity to play a small part, really, in the training of Hebrew, English, and Spanish language Bible college students for ministry. And my prayer is that all these people whose lives I've touched, at least in a small way, would affect the world for Christ way more than I ever could. Had I died in that car accident, I would have never had the privilege of meeting my wife. I would have never had the privilege of fathering 2 children. And my prayer is that these children would affect the world for the cause of Christ way more than I ever could. The preserving power of God is not limited to one people group to use for his purposes. My car accident is just one way for me to reflect on God's providence. You surely have at least 1 or 2 or 3 situations like this, like my accident in your life, have demonstrated that God has kept you on earth for his great purposes, to be part of his sovereign plan. We are all the benefactors of God's providence. As God guides all circumstances for his glory, we as human beings, as part of the church, we're blessed to be able to see what God does through people, including ourselves. So reading the book of Esther is an occasion in which we remember and celebrate God's promises to humankind in saving the ancestry of Jesus, the Messiah, Savior of the world. Reading this book is an occasion for praise. It's an occasion to praise God, not just for saving a particular people group, but more importantly, saving humankind through permitting his Son to come and thereby keeping his word.